Resuming page 561. Additional views of Senator Frank Church concerning covert action. I believe this committee has produced a remarkably thorough report on the difficult subject of covert action. However, it is my own personal view that the covert action capability of the U.S. intelligence community ought to be circumscribed more sharply than a majority of the full committee was willing to recommend. I include these additional remarks to explain my point of view. We live in a dangerous world. Soviet submarines silently traverse the ocean floors, carrying transcontinental missiles with the capacity to strike at our heartland. The nuclear arms race threatens to continue its deadly spiral toward Armageddon. In this perilous setting, it is imperative for the United States to maintain a strong and effective intelligence service. On this proposition, we can ill afford to be of two minds. We have no choice other than to gather, analyze, and assess, to the best of our abilities, vital information on the intent and prowess of foreign adversaries, present or potential. Without an adequate intelligence gathering apparatus, we would be unable to gauge with confidence our defense requirements, unable to conduct an informed foreign policy, unable to control through satellite surveillance a runaway nuclear arms race. Quote, "The winds and waves are always on the side of the ablest navigators," end quote, wrote Gibbon. Those nations without a skillful intelligence service must navigate beneath a clouded sky. While one may debate the quality of the agency's performance, there has never been any question about the propriety and necessity of its involvement in the process of gathering and evaluating foreign intelligence, nor have serious questions been raised about the means used to acquire such information, whether from the overt sources, technical devices, or by clandestine method. What has become controversial is quite unrelated to intelligence, but has to do instead with the so-called covert operations of the CIA, those secret efforts to manipulate events within foreign countries in ways presumed to serve the interests of the United States. Nowhere are such activities vouchsafed in the statutory language which created the agency in 1947. Quote, "No indication was given in the statute that the CIA would become a vehicle for foreign political action or clandestine political warfare," end quote, notes Harry Howe Ransom, a scholar who has written widely and thought deeply about the problems of intelligence in modern society. Mr. Ransom concludes that, quote, "probably no other organization of the federal government has taken such liberties in interpreting its legally assigned functions as has the CIA," end quote. The legal basis for this political action arm of the CIA is very much open to question. Certainly, the legislative history of the 1947 Act fails to indicate that Congress anticipated the CIA would ever engage in covert political warfare abroad. End of page 561. Beginning page 562. The CIA points to a catch-all phrase contained in the 1947 Act as a rationalization for its operational prerogatives. A clause in the statute permits the agency, quote, "to perform such other functions and duties related to intelligence affecting the national security as the National Security Council may, from time to time, direct," end quote. These vague and seemingly innocuous words have been seized upon as the green light for the CIA intervention around the world. Moreover, these interventions into the political affairs of foreign countries soon came to overshadow the agency's original purpose of gathering and evaluating information. The United States came to adopt the methods and accept the value system of the, quote, enemy, end quote. In the secret world of covert action, we threw off all restraints, not content merely to discreetly subsidize foreign political parties, labor unions, and newspapers. The Central Intelligence Agency soon began to directly manipulate the international politics of other countries, spending many millions of dollars annually. The CIA filled its bag with dirty tricks, ranging from bribery and false propaganda to schemes to, quote, alter the health, end quote, of unfriendly foreign leaders and undermine their regimes. The United States must acquire a longer view of history. We need not be so frightened by each Russian intervention. We need not feel so compelled to react in kind to each Russian move. We have gained little and lost a great deal by our past policy of compulsive interventionism. Above all, we have lost or grievously impaired the good name and reputation of the United States, from which we once drew a unique capacity to exercise matchless moral leadership. Where once we were admired, now we are resented. Where once we were welcome, now we are tolerated at best. In the eyes of millions of once friendly foreign people, the United States is today regarded with grave suspicion and distrust. I must lay the blame, in large measure, to the fantasy that it lay within our power to control other countries through the covert manipulation of their affairs. It formed part of a greater illusion that entrapped and enthralled our presidents, the illusion of American omnipotence. Nevertheless, I do not draw the conclusion of those who now argue that all American covert operations must be banned in the future. I can conceive of a dire emergency when timely clandestine action on our part might avert a nuclear holocaust and save an entire civilization. But for such extraordinary events, certainly we do not need a regiment of cloak and dagger men earning their campaign ribbons and, indeed, their promotions by planning new exploits throughout the world. Theirs is a self-generating enterprise. Once the capability for covert activity is established, the pressures brought to bear on the president to use it are immense. I myself believe that all covert activity unrelated to gathering of essential intelligence should be severed entirely from the CIA. If some circumstance in the future should require a secret operation in a foreign land, let it be done under the direct aegis of the State's Department. And if the covert activity is not impelled by the imperative of survival itself, then let it be directly connected with legitimate security interests of the United States in a way that conforms with our traditional. End of page 562, beginning page 563. Belief in freedom. Then, if our hand were exposed, we could scorn the cynical doctrine of, quote, plausible denial, end quote, and say, quote, yes, we were there, and proud of it, end quote. We were there in Western Europe, helping to restore democratic governments in the aftermath of the Second World War. It was only after our faith gave way to fear that we began to act as a self-appointed sentinel of the status quo. Then it was that all the dark arts of secret intervention, bribery, blackmail, abduction, assassination, were put to the service of reactionary and repressive regimes that can never for long escape or withstand the volcanic forces of change. And the United States, as a result, became even more identified with the claims of the old order instead of the aspirations of the new. The remedy is clear. American foreign policy must be made to conform once more to our historic ideals. The same fundamental belief in freedom and popular government that once made us a beacon of hope for the downtrodden and oppressed throughout the world. Frank Church. End of page 563. Beginning page 564. Additional views of Senators Walter F. Mondale, Gary Hart, and Philip Hart. We fully support the analysis, findings, and recommendations of this report. If implemented, the recommendations will go far toward providing our nation with an intelligence community that is more effective in protecting this country, more accountable to the American public, and more responsive to our Constitution and our laws. The key to effective implementation of these recommendations is a new Intelligence Oversight Committee with legislative authority. Committees of Congress have only two sources of power: control over the purse and public discourse. The Select Committee had no authority of any kind over the purse strings of the intelligence community, only the power of disclosure. The preparation of this volume of the final report was a case study in the shortcomings of this volume of the final report. The preparation of this volume of the final report was a case study in the shortcomings of disclosure as the sole instrument of oversight. Our experience as a committee graphically demonstrates why legislative authority, in particular the power to authorize appropriations, is essential if a new oversight committee is to handle classified intelligence matters securely and effectively. In preparing the report, the Select Committee bent over backwards to ensure that there were no intelligence sources, methods, or other classified material in the text. As a result, important portions of the report have been excised or significantly abridged. In some cases, the changes were clearly justified on security grounds, but in other cases, the CIA, in our view, used the classification stamp not for security, but to censor material that would be embarrassing, inconvenient, or likely to provoke an adverse public reaction to CIA activities. Some of the so-called security objections of the CIA were so outlandish that they were dismissed out of hand. The CIA wanted to delete reference to the Bay of Pigs as a paramilitary operation. They wanted to eliminate any reference to CIA activities in Laos. They wanted the committee to excise testimony given in public before the television cameras. But on other more complex issues, the committee's necessary and proper concern for caution enabled the CIA to use the clearance process to alter the report to the point where some of its most important implications are either lost or obscured in the vague language. We shall abide by the committee's agreement on the facts which are to remain classified. We did what we had to do under the circumstances, and the full texts are available to the Senate in classified form. Within those limits, however, we believe it is important to point out those areas in the final report which no longer fully reflect the work of the committee. For example, because of editing for classification reasons, the italicized passages in the findings and recommendations obscure the end of page 564, beginning page 565. Significant policy issues involved. The discussion of the role of U.S. academics in the CIA's clandestine activities has been so diluted that its scope and impact on the American academic institutions is no longer clear. The description of the CIA's clandestine activities within the United States, as well as the extent to which CIA uses its ostensibly overt domestic contact division for such activities, has been modified to the point where the committee's concern about the CIA's blurring of the line between overt and covert, foreign and domestic activities has been lost. Important sections which deal with the problems of, quote, cover, end quote, were eliminated. It made clear that for many years the CIA has known and been concerned about its poor cover abroad, and that the agency's cover problems are not the result of recent congressional investigations of intelligence activities. The deletion of one important passage makes it impossible to explain why unwitting Senate collaboration may be necessary to make effective certain aspects of clandestine activities. The CIA insisted upon eliminating the actual name of the Vietnamese Institute mentioned on page 454, thereby suppressing the extent to which the CIA was able to use that organization to manipulate public and congressional opinion in the United States to support the Vietnam War. Although the committee recommends a much higher standard for undertaking covert actions and a tighter control system, we are unable to report the facts from our in-depth covert action case studies which paint a picture of the high political costs and generally meager benefits of covert programs. The final cost of these secret operations is the inability of the American people to debate and decide on the future scope of covert action in a fully informed way. The fact that the committee cannot present its complete case to the public on these specific policy issues illustrates the dilemma secrecy poses for our democratic system of checks and balances. If the Select Committee, after due consideration, decided to disclose more information on these issues by itself, the ensuing public debate might well focus on that disclosure rather than on the committee's recommendations. If the Select Committee asked the full Senate to endorse such disclosure, we would be unfairly asking our colleagues to make judgments on matters unfamiliar to them and which are the committee's responsibility. In the field of intelligence, secrecy has eroded the system of checks and balances on which our constitutional government rests. In our view, the only way this system can be restored is by creating a legislative intelligence oversight committee with the power to authorize appropriations. The experience of this committee has been that such authority is crucial if the new committee is to be able to find out what the intelligence agencies are doing and to take action to stop things when necessary without public disclosure. It is the only way to protect legitimate intelligence secrets, yet effectively represent the public. And end of page 565, beginning page 566. The Congress, in intelligence decisions affecting America's international reputation and basic values. A legislative oversight committee with the power to authorize appropriations for intelligence is essential if America is to govern its intelligence agencies with the system of checks and balances mandated by the Constitution. Philip Hart, Walter F. Mondale, Gary Hart. End of page 566, beginning page 567. Introduction to Separate Views of Senators John G. Tower, Howard H. Baker, and Barry M. Goldwater. Our mutual concern that certain remedial measures proposed by this committee threaten to impose undue restrictions upon vital and legitimate intelligence functions, prevents us in varying degrees from rendering an unqualified endorsement to this committee's findings and recommendations in their entirety. We also perceive a need to emphasize areas of common agreement, such as our unanimous endorsement of intelligence reforms heretofore outlined by the President. Therefore, we have elected to articulate our common concerns and observations as viewed from our individual perspectives in separate views which follow. John Tower, Vice Chairman. Howard H. Baker, Jr. Barry M. Goldwater. End of page 567, beginning page 568. Separate views of Senator John G. Tower, Vice Chairman. When the Senate mandated this committee to conduct an investigation and study of activities of our nation's intelligence community, it recognized the need for congressional participation in decisions which impact virtually every aspect of American life. The gravamen of our charge was to examine the nation's intelligence needs and the performance of agencies charged with intelligence responsibilities, and to make such assessments and recommendations as, in our judgment, are necessary to maintain the delicate balance between individual liberties and national security. I do not believe the committee's reports and accompanying staff studies comply fully with the charge to maintain that balance. The committee's recommendations make significant departures from an overriding lesson of the American experience. The right of American citizens to be free is inextricably bound to their right to be secure. I do not question the existence of intelligence excesses. The abuses of power, both foreign and domestic, are well documented in the committee's report. Nor do I question the need for expanded legislative, executive, and judicial involvement in intelligence policy and practices. The, quote, uncertainties as to the authority of United States intelligence and related agencies, end quote, was explicitly recognized by Senate Resolution 21. Nevertheless, I question and take exception to the committee's report to the extent that its recommendations are either unsupported by the factual record or unduly restrict attainment of valid intelligence objectives. I believe that the 183 separate recommendations proposing new details and reporting procedures not only exceed the number and scope of documented abuses, but represent overreaction. If adopted in their totality, they would unnecessarily limit the effectiveness of the nation's intelligence community. In the area of foreign intelligence, the committee was specifically mandated to prevent, quote, disclosure outside the select committee of any information which would adversely affect the intelligence activities of the federal government, end quote. In his separate view, Senator Barry Goldwater clearly points up the damage to our efforts in Latin America, occasioned by release of the, quote, staff report, end quote, on covert action in Chile. I objected to releasing the Chile report and fully support Senator Goldwater's assessment of the adverse impact of this, quote, ironic, end quote, and ill-advised disclosure. Another unfortunate aspect of the committee's foreign report is its response to incidents of lack of accountability and control by recommending the imposition of a layering of executive branch reviews at operational levels and needless bifurcation of the decision-making process. The President's reorganization, which centralizes foreign intelligence. End of page 568, beginning page 569. Operations, and provides for constant review and oversight, is termed, quote, ambiguous, end quote. Yet the committee's recommended statutory changes would, in brackets, in addition to duplication and multiplication of decisions, in brackets, add little except to ensure that the existing functions set up by the President's program were, quote, explicitly empowered, end quote, reaffirmed, end quote, or provided with, quote, adequate staff, end quote, by concentration upon such details as which cabinet officer should chair the various review groups or speak for the President. The committee's approach unnecessarily restricts presidential discretion without enhancing efficiency, control, or accountability. The President's reorganization is a thorough, comprehensive response to a long-standing problem. It should be supported, not pilloried, with statutory amendments accounting to little more than alternative management techniques. It is far more appropriate for the Congress to place primary legislative emphasis on establishing a structure for congressional oversight which is compatible with the executive reorganization, while eliminating the present proliferation of committees and subcommittees asserting jurisdiction over intelligence activities. Another area in which I am unable to agree with the committee's approach is covert action. It would be a mistake to attempt to require that the Congress receive prior notification of all covert activities. Senator Howard Baker repeatedly urged the committee to adopt the more realistic approach of obligating the executive to keep the Congress, quote, fully and currently informed, end quote. I believe any attempt by the legislative branch to impose a stricter prior notification requirement upon the executive's foreign policy initiatives is neither feasible nor consistent with our constitutionally mandated separation of powers. On the domestic front, the committee has documented flagrant abuses. Of particular concern were the political misuses of such agencies as the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service. However, while thoroughly probing these reprehensible activities and recommending needed changes in accountability, mechanisms. The committee's, quote, corrective, end quote, focus is almost exclusively on prohibitions or limitations of agency practices. I hope this approach to remedial action will not be read as broad criticism of the overall performance of the intelligence community or a minimization of the committee's own finding that, quote, a fair assessment must place a major part of the blame upon the failure of senior executive officials and Congress, end quote. In fact, I am persuaded that the failure of high officials to investigate these abuses or to terminate them when they learned of them was almost as reprehensible as the abuses themselves. A further objectionable aspect of the committee's approach is the scope of the proposed limitations on the use of electronic surveillance and informants as investigative techniques. With respect to electronic surveillance of Americans suspected of intelligence activities inimical to the national interest, the committee would limit authority for such probes to violations of specific criminal statutes. This proposal fails to address the real problem of utilizing electronic surveillance against myriad forms of espionage. A majority of the committee recommended this narrow standard while acknowledging that existing statutes offer inadequate coverage of, quote, modern forms of espionage, end quote. The committee took no testimony on revision of the espionage laws and, end of page 569, beginning page 570, simply proposed that another committee, quote, explore the necessity for amendments, end quote, to prohibit electronic surveillance in these cases pending such revision is to sanction an unnecessary risk to the national security. In adopting this proposition, the committee not only ignores the fact that appellate courts in 2 federal circuits have upheld the executive's inherent authority to conduct such surveillance, but also fails to endorse the Attorney General's comprehensive proposal to remedy objection to current practices. The proposed safeguards, which include requirements for the Attorney General's certification of hostile foreign intelligence involvement and issuance of a judicial warrant as a condition precedent to electronic surveillance, represent a significant expanse of civil liberty protections. The proposal enjoys bipartisan support in Congress, and I join those members urging prompt enactment. I am also opposed to the methods and means proposed by the committee to regulate the use of informants. Informants have been in the past and will remain in the future a vital tool of law enforcement. To adopt the committee's position and impose stringent mechanical time limits on the use of informants, particularly regarding their use against terrorist or hostile foreign intelligence activities in the United States, would be to place our faith in standards which are not only illusory but unworkable. In its overly broad approach to eliminating intelligence abuses, the committee report urges departure from the Congress's role as a partner in national security policy and comes dangerously close to being a blueprint for authorizing congressional management of the day-to-day affairs of the intelligence community. Whether this management is attempted through prior notification or a shopping list of prohibitive statutes and regulations, it is a task for which the legislative branch of government is ill-suited. I believe the adverse impact which would be occasioned by enactment of all the committee recommendations would be substantial. Substantial segments of the committee's work product will assist this Congress in proceeding with the task of ensuring the conduct of necessary intelligence activities in a manner consistent with our obligation to safeguard the rights of American citizens. However, we must now step back from the Klieg, lights, and abuse-dominated atmosphere and balance our findings and recommendations with a recognition that our intelligence agencies and the men and women who serve therein have been and will always be essential to the existence of our nation. This committee was asked to provide a constitutionally acceptable framework for Congress to assist in that mission. We were not mandated to render our intelligence systems so constrained as to be fit for employment only in an ideal world. In addition to the above remarks, I generally endorse the positions set forth in Senator Baker's individual views. I specifically endorse his views stating the need for legislation making it a criminal offense to publish the name of a United States intelligence officer stationed abroad undercover. End of page 570. Beginning page 571. His position that there must be a system of greater accountability by our intelligence operations to the United States Congress and the American people. His concern that the Congress exercise caution to ensure that a proper predicate exists before any recommendations for permanent reforms are enacted into law. His view that there be careful study before endorsing the committee's far-reaching recommendations, calling for an alternation of the intelligence community structure. I also support the individual views of Senator Goldwater. Further, I specifically endorse his assessment that only a small segment of the American public has ever doubted the integrity of the nation's intelligence agencies. His opinion that an intelligence system, however secret, does not place undue strain on our nation's constitutional government. His excellent statement concerning covert action as an essential tool of the President's foreign policy arsenal. His opposition to the publication of an annual aggregate figure for the United States intelligence, and his reasons therefor. His views and comments on the committee's recommendations regarding the National Security Council and the Office of the President, specifically comments number 12, 13, and 14. His view challenging the proposed limitation concerning the recruitment of foreigners by the Central Intelligence Agency. His views and general comments concerning the right of every American, including academics, clergymen, businessmen, and others, to cooperate with his government in its lawful pursuits. His views and general comments, for the reasons stated above, I regret that I am unable to sign the final report of the Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities. John G. Tower, Vice Chairman. End of page 570, beginning page 572. Individual views of Senator Barry Goldwater. This final report of the Select Committee on Intelligence Activities must be read with care. Historically, the work of the committee and its report are an outgrowth of a period in which disillusionment, dismay, and disaffection were all too prevalent in America. Failure in Vietnam and the Watergate scandals were prime contributors to the foregoing and helped produce a feeling that the ship of state was rudderless. Under these circumstances of confusion, the basic premises of our foreign policy came into question, with some taking refuge in isolationism as the only way out. Others reacted as though some demon needed to be exorcised and launched a kind of guerrilla attack upon our foreign policy. Pressure from the new isolationists and the demonologists forced a skittish Congress into asserting a greater influence over the conduct of our foreign policy. The results were mostly bad. Two good allies, Greece and Turkey, were alienated. Jewish emigration from Russia was reduced. The hands of our president were tied in the day-to-day conduct of foreign policy. U.S. intelligence was demoralized and its effectiveness greatly diminished. Our allies came to seriously question America's reliability, if not our collective sanity. Our adversaries took comfort in watching us tear ourselves apart. In the field of intelligence activities, the worst of it all occurred in the Senate on October 2nd, 1974, when the Hughes Amendment, ultimately the Hughes-Ryan Amendment, was included in the Foreign Aid Bill. Under its provisions, 6 committees of the Congress are required to be informed of any covert action conducted abroad. This means that approximately 50 senators and over 120 congressmen may receive highly sensitive information on a covert action program. It also means that public disclosure is almost inevitable, as proved to be the case in Angola. As the Soviet Union moved decisively in Africa, pushing its Cuban mercenaries in the vanguard, and as the word, quote, detente, end quote, came more and more to be understood as a game played under the rules favorable to Moscow, a new appraisal seemed to be arising among our fellow citizens. The pendulum had swung too far, and much damage was being done to the nation's foreign policy and the organizations necessary to its conduct. The foregoing was largely in the past tense, because it is my hope and belief that the period of self-criticism, if not self-flagellation, is coming. End of page 572. Beginning page 573. An end. To an end. If not, our once proud and strong nation is headed for very hard times. Covert action in Chile, 1963 to 1973. Throughout the, quote, foreign and military intelligence, end quote, section of the committee's final report, there are references to covert action in Chile, which are based on a staff report of the committee entitled Covert, quote, Covert Action in Chile, 1963-1973, end quote. Because the report was a, quote, staff report, end quote, senators on the committee were not entitled to submit opposing views. In my opinion, the staff report is a distortion of history and will not stand the test of time. The following is what I believe to be a fair representation of events in Chile from 1963 to 1973 and any U.S. involvement. On December 4, 1973, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence Activities held public hearings on covert action in Chile while covering the years 1963 to 1973. In his opening statement, Chairman Church stated that, quote, the nature and extent of the American role in the overthrow of a democratically elected Chilean government are matters for deep and continuing public concern." End quote. The chairman then introduced the staff director, who, with other members of the staff, summarized a staff report entitled, quote, "Covert Action in Chile, 1963 to 1973, end quote. The staff conclusion was even more specific, quote, "In the period 1970 through 1973, in order to prevent a Marxist leader from coming to power by democratic means, the U.S. worked through covert action to subvert democratic processes. This interference in the internal affairs of another country served to weaken the party we sought to assist and created internal dissensions, which over time led to the weakening and, for the present time at least, an end to constitutional government in Chile." End quote. These assertions and the committee report on which they are based are misleading because they make it appear that the United States was responsible for the downfall of a respectable and truly democratic government. The real character of Allende and his coalition was ignored by excluding both public statements of philosophy and intent, as well as the public record of highly illegal actions while in office, omitting publicly available information, not to mention the exclusion of voluminous classified intelligence dealing with Chilean support of Soviet and Cuban international subversion, makes it difficult for the American public to understand why anti-Allende operations were undertaken by 3 successive U.S. administrations. Moreover, the report concludes that, quote, "fears, often badly exaggerated or distorted, appeared to have activated officials in Washington." End quote. Thus, covert action in Chile, 1963 to 1973, leaves the impression of U.S. bungling in Chilean affairs, induced by a corrosive fear of communism and Marxism. While there may have been some mistakes made in the conduct of our affairs in Chile, the threat of a communist dictatorship under Allende was very real. To set the record straight, here are facts that should be taken into account. 1. Salvador Allende and the Unidad Popular. An avowed Marxist-Leninist, Allende participated in the creation of the Chilean Socialist Party in 1933, the year he graduated from medical school. He was elected a federal deputy in 1937 and was, end of page 573, beginning page 574, named Secretary General of the Socialist Party in 1943. Since its inception, the Chilean Socialist Party has been an extreme interpreter of Marxist-Leninist dogma, espousing violent revolution for Chile and the rest of Latin America. Castro's Cuba became the socialist model, and many young socialists were trained in Cuba in guerrilla warfare, as well as in political action. Allende personally headed the Chilean delegation in the 1966 Tricontinental Conference in Havana and was a key figure in the creation of the Cuban-sponsored Latin American Solidarity Organization called LASO, L-A-S-O, created specifically to foment guerrilla warfare in Latin America. It was the guiding force for the, quote, Che, end quote, Guevara guerrilla adventure in Bolivia in 1967. In 1970, Allende was listed as a director of the Chilean Committee of Support for the Bolivian People and the National Liberation Army, known as ELN. E-L-N. Meanwhile, the stronger but less violent Chilean Communist Party had joined the Socialist Party in a coalition which backed Allende as its presidential candidate in 4 presidential elections: 1952, 1958, 1964, and 1970. Allende was an active member of many Communist Front organizations, particularly the World Peace Council, of which he was vice president. During his first visit to the USSR in 1954, intelligence gathered over a period of many years has provided what Ambassador Corey calls, quote, certain knowledge that the Soviet Union and other communist governments and organizations provided substantial sums for covert political action to the Communist Party, to the Socialist Party, and to Allende himself, end quote. The significance of Allende's election as president of Chile was thus readily apparent, or should have been. Allende affirmed publicly in his 1970 campaign, as he had in previous campaigns for the presidency, that his intention was to bring about an irreversible Marxist revolution in Chile. He viewed himself as the man who would do what Castro failed to do: destroy America's leadership in Latin America. Allende minced no pre-election words. Prior to his election, he stated flat out that the United States was to be treated as, quote, public enemy number 1, end quote, in the Western Hemisphere. Allende's tactics centered on using constitutional tools to fashion a socialist revolution, but he never pretended to espouse traditional parliamentary democracy. A minority president who received only 36.5% of the popular vote, he declared 3 months after taking office, "I am the president of the Unidad Popular, or Popular. I am not the president of all the Chileans." He and Castro chose to follow different roads, but Allende's intentions were never really masked. To quote again from his 1970 presidential campaign, "Cuba in the Caribbean and the Socialist Chile in the Southern Cone will make the revolution in Latin America." Was this empty campaign rhetoric? Soon after the 1970 election, Allende met secretly with Latin American revolutionaries and pledged covert support to them. Ambassador Corey has written, quote, in 1970, as in 1963, we know beyond a shadow, end of page 574, beginning page 575, of a reasonable doubt that an Allende government intended to use the processes and laws of what it called formal democracy to eliminate and replace it with what it called popular democracy. From 1961 to 1970, the embassy, like the majority of Congress, agreed that such a development would do serious harm to U.S. interests and influence for good in the world, end quote. Two, efforts of the Allende government to destroy democratic institutions. Communist Party leaders were largely in charge of the economic program of the Allende government. The communists intended gradually to replace private enterprise by state enterprise, thus enabling the government to assume complete social and economic power. The government therefore drew up a list of all Chilean corporations whose capital reserves exceeded $500,000. These companies, representing 82% of the capital holdings of all companies incorporated in Chile, were earmarked for nationalization. Congress attempted to block this government program by passing legislation defining the economic areas subject to government ownership, but the government continued to take over Chilean firms, using methods which became progressively more illegal. These methods range from expropriations declared unconstitutional by the Chilean Supreme Court to requisitions, many of which were declared illegal by the Chilean Office of the Comptroller General, to, quote, decrees of insistence, end quote, a rarely used judicial tool created to resolve differences of legal interpretations between the judiciary and the executive. In agriculture, all farms exceeding 80 hectares of irrigated land were made subject to legal expropriation. These, quote, legal, end quote, these, quote, legal, end quote, expropriations were supplemented by those of roving armed bands who took possession of agricultural properties by force without any intervention by the Chilean police. Similarly, a series of economic pressures was exerted to silence the independent media, including coercion, bribery, the manipulation of government control over credit, imports and prices, and the incitement of strikes. As an adjunct to economic pressures, the Allende government began to develop the concept of, quote, popular power, end quote, creating parallel revolutionary organizations which duplicated the functions of existing legal organizations. For example, special communal commands known as JAPs were established to control the distribution of essential articles, mainly food. Government supplies were channeled through these new organizations rather than through established retailed outlets. Of Soviet origin, the communal commands had the dual function of displacing, quote, bourgeoisies, end quote, organizations and of training their members for armed revolution. Prior to the Allende regime, Chile had a strong democratic tradition and a firm commitment to constitutional processes. Under the Allende regime, its institutions fought long and tenaciously to save themselves from destruction by legal constitutional means. When the government violated Chilean law, protests were filled with the courts and, quote, Contraloria, end quote. Footnote 1. Reading footnote 1. Comptroller General of the Republic who supervised the legality of the government's actions. End of page 575, beginning page 576. When the courts and the Contraloria objected to these violations, however, the government either paid no heed to these decisions or overruled them through, quote, decrees of insistence, end quote, which were themselves illegal. The National Congress also tried to check these violations of the law by impeaching the ministers responsible for them, but Allende merely moved the ousted ministers from one post to another, thus thwarting the purpose of congressional sanctions. Finally, when all the protests of the Congress, the courts, and the Contraloria had been repeatedly ignored, these bodies solemnly declared that the Allende government had placed itself both placed itself outside both the law and the Constitution. These declarations were made by the Supreme Court on May 26, 1973, by the Contraloria on July 2, 1973, and by the Chamber of Deputies on August 22, 1973. The full text of the Chamber of Deputies resolution and that of a subsequent August 29, 1973, report of the Bar Association are appended in full because they record many of the abuses and illegalities of the Allende government and also illustrate the inability of true democratic institutions to coexist with a Marxist government. The Chamber's declaration was, in fact, a notice to the armed forces that the legal and constitutional order of the country had broken down. The military coup of September 11, 1973, was the tragic climax of a long process of political polarization, exacerbated by the worst economic crisis in Chile's history. Inflation exceeded 300% in 1973. The trade balance deficit in the same year exceeded $450 million. The foreign debt increased 60% in 3 years. As the economic situation deteriorated, strikes proliferated, crippling the country. It was not U.S., quote, interference, end quote, but rather a minority's attempt to impose doctrinaire Marxism on a democratic framework, which led to the establishment of the present military government. 3. Chile, a base for Soviet and Cuban subversion. Within the Allende government, the Communist Party was largely responsible for running the economic program, counting heavily on Soviet support. There were 1,300 odd Soviets in Chile as of March 1972. Soviet bloc credits of some $200 million had been extended. Moreover, the Soviets were dangling an offer of $300 million to the Chilean military for the purpose of military equipment. The Soviets, however, left to the Cubans most of the revolutionary guidance and support provided to the Allende coalition. Under Allende, Chile became the center for Cuban operations in the southern cone of Latin America. Juan Carretero Ibanez, alias, quote, Ariel, end quote, former chief of the Cuban Liberation Directorate, LD, for Latin America, the Cuban Intelligence and Executive Action Agency, arrived in Chile in October 1970, just prior to Allende's inauguration. He was soon followed by Luis Fernandez Ona, a senior intelligence officer of the DGI, who became Allende's son-in-law. Chile reestablished diplomatic relations with Cuba, and the Cuban embassy rapidly reached a end of page 576, beginning page 577. Strength of 54. Later, nearly 100 officers. Cuban visitors to Chile averaged 100 per month.